So more information has come out about Israel knowing that the October 7th attacks was going to happen. I have brought you earlier information about this. And in fact, it's not just in some crazy radical magazines. Not that I'm upset with crazy radical magazines. I love crazy radical magazines. But even the New York Times, and this is back in November, said Israel knew that this attack was going to happen. And I brought you this at the time, even though this is in the pages of even the New York Times, it has not been talked about that much. And in fact, largely ignored by your mainstream media, despite it being covered in the New York Times. And sometimes the New York Times or these other mainstream media outlets, these mainstream corporate outlets, something they will do in order to get the story out, but then suppress it, is do one article on it and never mention it again, which seems to be the case. And in fact, right now, if you say on mainstream media that Israel knew about these attacks, you will probably be called a conspiracy theorist. And I have seen other clips of people in the ruling elite circles or the theorists who say Israel knew October 7th was going to happen. Really? Does that include the New York Times? Are those wackadoo conspiracy theorists of the New York Times? I mean, they are conspiracy theorists when it comes to like Russiagate, but when it comes to this is even accepted by your mainstream liberal worldview. Israel knew Hamas's attack plan more than a year ago. And in a moment, I'm getting to the new information. Don't worry. A blueprint reviewed by the Times laid out the attack in detail. Not just a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Not just word on the street has it, detailed written documents of how it was going to go down. Israeli officials obtained Hamas's entire battle plan for October 7th terrorist attack more than a year before it happened. Documents, emails, and interviews show the approximately 40-page document. That is some detailed plans. That is not... A guy walked up to me and said, I think Hamas is up to something. No. This is a 40-page document called Jericho Wall that outlined point by point exactly the kind of devastating invasion that led to the deaths of about 1,200 people. Although what New York Times won't mention there is many of those 1,200 were killed by the IDF. That's neither here nor there. Let's keep going. Hamas followed the blueprint with shocking precision. So Israel had the blueprint and Hamas followed the blueprint. Those seem to be the two kind of important details of knowing about a plan, is A, knowing about it, and B, whether it was followed. And both of those things are true. The document called for a barrage of rockets at the outset of the attack, drones to knock down the security cameras, automated machine guns, the border, gunmen to pour into Israel en masse, motorcycles on foot, all of which happened October 7th. The plan also included details about location and size of Israeli military forces, communication hubs, and other sensitive information, raising questions about how Hamas gathered their intelligence and whether there were leaks in the Israeli security establishment. Oh, maybe Israel provided some of this information because it was information that you wouldn't expect Hamas to have. Details about Israeli military actions, movements, and size, etc., locations. The document circulated widely among Israeli military and intelligence leaders. Again, circulated widely. So not like one guy got the document. One guy had the document and was waving around and no one listened. This was being read by a lot within Israel, within the intelligence community. But it gets even worse. As Ben Swan has come out with a new report, which a lot of it is rehashing what I just read to you from the New York Times, but there is some new information, which I'm going to play right here about Egypt.
Days before the attack, and then again 3 days before the attack, Egypt's intelligence officials actually sent repeated warnings to the highest levels of the Israeli government. In one of those warnings, Egypt's premier intelligence minister, General Abbas Kamel, personally called Netanyahu and warned him that Hamas was about to do, quote, something unusual, a terrible operation. Unnamed Egyptian officials told Ynet News that they were shocked by Netanyahu's indifference to the news. But Israel didn't have to trust or believe Egypt.
Shocked by Netanyahu's indifference. I wonder why.
Because actually, most of the warnings of the October 7th attack came from Israeli civilians and the Israeli military itself. The civilians and soldiers who brought these emergency warnings to the military were ignored. And in some cases, strangely enough, threatened with legal action. So let's go all the way back to 2022.
Threatened with legal action for repeating what had been revealed, that Hamas was planning something with a 40-page document and details, a blueprint of what was going to be done. I'm not going to play the rest of it. You're welcome to look it up on Ben Swan's Twitter, but he then gets into the New York Times article that I just brought to you. The new information, which adds to the New York Times article, is that Egypt's intelligence services were also telling Israel, here's what's going to happen. On top of all that, you had Hamas posting videos of training with hang gliders, which they ended up using to get over the wall, of other types of training. So it was not all that secretive. You have Israel clearly knowing it's going to happen for a year in advance, according to the New York Times. You have Egypt telling Israel this is going to happen at least a week in advance, saying it's happening now. Like, I suppose if you wanted to try and, do some mental gymnastics and defend Israel and say, oh no, Israel may have known, but they couldn't have stopped it, because your first thing you'd say probably would be, well, they didn't know when it was going to happen. So even knowing what was going to happen, they couldn't stop it because they didn't know when. Well, in fact, here you have Egypt saying, it's now. It's this week. It's happening in a day or two. There it is. It's happening. They're running in right now. We're like literally watching them. Happening now. There they go. Look at what they're doing. Oh my God. There it is. And yet Israel was, quote unquote, so unprepared that they literally had tanks driving hours to try and arrive on the scene. It took them hours to get there in some cases, because they were completely unprepared. Many of the soldiers, IDF soldiers in the barracks, were so unprepared and had no idea what was going down that they were shot in their beds, meaning there wasn't even alert to get them out of their beds. And then their communications were all haywire. Israel seemed completely and utterly unprepared. But as Ben Swan points out there, we also have Netanyahu seeming shockingly unconcerned about this 40-page detailed blueprint, according to the New York Times, that they knew about for a year in advance. Why would you say all this? If you knew all this, why would you just say we were unprepared? Why would you not be prepared? The only thing one can kind of come up with, the only reason that I could come up with, and let me know if you have other ideas for why Israel would not prepare for the thing they knew was going to happen, is that they, on some level, maybe a very high level, maybe a very clear level, wanted this to happen because they feel, it doesn't in my eyes or most of the world's, but in their eyes, it justifies the ethnic cleansing that they've wanted to do for decades and decades. And of course, they began in the 1940s and 1950s. In their minds and in their propaganda, now we have the justification for completely murdering, ethnic cleansing the entirety of the Gaza Strip, and we will continue that no matter what. It also, all of that explains why Israel does not actually want a ceasefire. All evidence, if you get past the propaganda from Western media, is that Hamas has agreed to multiple ceasefire deals as long as they mean legitimate ceasefire, as long as they're not a pause, as long as they're not give us all your hostages and then we'll still bomb the shit out of you. As long as there's actual ceasefire, ongoing ceasefire, Hamas has agreed to it, and Israel will not agree to any of it. And Israel has said, this was covered in the early days of this, after October 7th, that the Israeli government had said they could return all the hostages a day and this would continue. Meaning we're going to continue our genocide whether they return all the hostages or not. The only conclusion you can come to is that Israel wanted this to happen because they view it as useful to justifying their genocide. I did a poll over on my YouTube community page, youtube.com/moment of clarity. Many of you are watching there right now. Here's what it has revealed so far. I pointed that there's new evidence showing Israel knew about it, so why didn't Israel prepare or stop? Option number 1, Israel allowed the attack to justify ethnic cleansing. Option number 2, I don't believe Israel actually knew beforehand, which would be kind of a moron response considering all the coverage. And number 3, the Israeli government is simply incompetent. With 91% of the votes, people are saying Israel allowed the attack to justify ethnic cleansing. And that's with 435 votes. This poll is struggling to live. It's just getting started. So that's at youtube.com/moment of clarity.